They wheeled it out onto the gravel on a flat steel dolly, 9 feet of warped, water-stained walnut with its hands frozen at some hour nobody alive could name. And the whole crowd was laughing before Roy Tillman ever opened his mouth. It was a dead clock, weights gone, pendulum gone, the long door sprung off true, the movement seized solid under 60 years of grime. And the two men hauling it set it down so hard the bonnet rattled, because to every soul on those hay bales it was firewood with a face. And what none of them could see, perched there in the cold October light of the Sumac County estate auction, was that by midnight this silent, useless, mocked-at clock would settle every last debt Walter Pole owed in this world. It leaned there against the side of the auction trailer like a drunk man waiting to be told to go home. Somebody hollered that it was the corpse of a clock and they ought to bury it. And a thin ripple of mean laughter went down the rows, and Roy Tillman, wiry and quick under his cream straw boater with the black band, walked a slow showman's circle around it, tapping his gavel against his palm. Now, folks, he sang out. That thin mobile mouth already grinning, the Hartwell place foreclosed, and the bank wants it bare, and somebody's got to take this monument off our hands. Who'll start her? Who'll give me $5 for 9 feet of genuine antique kindling? And the Rose laughed again, easy and cruel, the way a crowd will laugh at a thing that cannot laugh back. That was when Cyrus Bolts got to his feet. You could not miss Cyrus, broad and barrel-chested in his red and black buffalo check, Mackinaw hanging open over his denim bibs, a hard round belly leading the way, his ruddy-jowled face split wide in that gap-toothed grin he saved for other men's bad luck. He was the scrap dealer, the salvage man, the fellow who weighed your grandmother's memories on a flatbed scale and paid you by the pound, and he turned half around so the whole yard could hear him. "I'll bid on it," he boomed, "for the wood. $2 a board foot for kindling, Walt," because Walter Pole had raised his hand. Quiet, unhurried, the way he did everything. The tall, stooped old man in the faded olive-drab work jacket had lifted 2 fingers off his knee, and Cyrus had seen it, and Cyrus was delighted. "You buying time," he crowed, "or you buying stupid? That thing's been dead longer'n your shop's been open, old man." The laughter came around again, and this time it had Walter's name in its mouth. He did not flinch at it. He stood there in the thin sunlight, 67 years old, tall and raw-boned with his shoulders gone soft and round at the top, his long gaunt face still as a church on a weekday, and he watched the clock and not the men. Roy took Cyrus's number for a joke and ran with it, and the bidding went up in dollars and half-dollars, the way a thing goes up when nobody really wants it. The crowd egging it along just to watch the old clock man keep nodding. 40, 50, Walter gave Roy a small nod. 60, another. He never argued, never raised his voice, never once turned to answer Cyrus Bolts. He only pushed his round wire spectacles up the bridge of his nose with one large work-worn finger and nodded again. And his pale gray-blue eyes stayed on the dovetails of that ruined case the whole time, reading them the way another man might read a letter from far away. 70, 80, the half-grins were going thin now. Folks had figured the joke would end at 20, and here the old fool was, climbing 90, 95. $95, Roy Tillman said. And the patter went out of his voice for just a second, because 95 was real money, and he knew as well as anyone in that yard what $95 was to Walter Pole. He brought the gavel down. Sold to Mr. Pole, and they laughed him all the way to the cashier's table, where he counted it out in soft, worn bills, his last dollars, the very bottom of him, and folded the receipt into the breast of his vest like a man putting away something that mattered. You have to understand what $95 was to know what he had just done. Walter Pohl was the last clock repairman in Sumac County, and very likely the last for 100 miles in any direction, and that was not the proud thing it might once have been. It was a slow, quiet sentence the century had handed down. His shop sat on the main street between the shuttered millinery and the feed store, Pohl Clock and Watch, lettered in gold paint, going to flakes on the window, and for 40 years men had brought him their mantel clocks and their carriage clocks and their grandfather clocks and the railroad watches their fathers had carried. And he had taken them in his big, careful hands and made them keep time again. But the wristwatch had come, cheap and certain and strapped to every wrist, and after the wristwatch the electric wall clock that ran off the socket and never needed a soul to wind it or love it or understand it, and between the two of them they had quietly killed his trade without ever once raising their voice. The bell over his door hardly rang any more. Behind the counter the wall was hung with movements nobody had come back for, brass and steel sleeping on their little hooks, and a past-due notice was taped to the inside of the glass where the morning light fell on it first. 3 months behind on the rent, the landlord's patience worn to a thread. The town had a word for Walter, and it was a kind word and a cruel one in the same breath. Finished, there goes old Pohl. Finished, a relic, a good man left over from a thing that's gone. They said it gently. That was almost the worst of it. And his bench told the rest. 40 years he had sat at that bench under the green-shaded lamp. And it was laid out the same now as it had been laid out the first morning. The loop, the oil cups, the rows of fine screwdrivers in their wooden block, the little brass parts trays, everything in its place under his hand without looking. Beside the bench, against the wall, where the afternoon sun reached, stood a second chair, a plain wooden chair with a faded cushion tied to the seat, and it was empty, and it had been empty for 2 years now. Edith's chair. His wife had sat there through the long, quiet afternoons with her mending or her tea, keeping him company while he worked, teasing him in that dry, gentle way she had. And on the shelf above the bench her photograph stood in a tin frame. A soft, round-cheeked woman with warm hazel eyes and silver curls pinned loose, half smiling, looking off at something just past the camera, a small cameo brooch at the throat of her dusty rose dress. He had not moved the chair. A man learns there are some empty places you do not fill and do not clear away. You simply work beside them. So why in the name of sense would a finished man spend his last $95 on a dead clock the whole county had laughed at? Because Walter Pohl had spent 50 years learning a thing the crowd on those hay bales would never have the patience to learn. That a stopped clock is not an empty clock. A stopped clock is a question. It is a question nobody has bothered to sit down and ask, because asking takes time, and the world had run clean out of time for such things. Everyone else looked at the ruined Hartwell case and saw rot and ruin and firewood. Walter looked at it and saw the hand of the man who had made it. He had stepped close while they jeered and run his thumb along the corner joinery, and the dovetails were cut tight and true and fine, hand-cut, cut by a craftsman who could have done them faster and chose to do them right. The pins set with a patience you cannot buy and cannot fake. The waist was joined the old careful way. There was a maker's grain to the whole thing, a signature with no name on it, and Walter had read enough of them in 50 years to know what he was reading. A careless man builds a clock to tell the hour. A careful man, a man like the one who had cut these joints, builds a clock to keep something. And a clock built to keep something does not give it up to laughter. It gives it up to patience, or it gives it up to no one at all. He could not have told you what was inside. He only knew the way he knew the weight of a balance wheel by holding it, that the question had not yet been asked, and that he was perhaps the last man left in the county willing to ask it. They loaded it onto the neighbor boy's borrowed flatbed truck with 2 planks and a deal of grunting, and Walter rode home beside the boy through the long blue end of the afternoon with the clock lashed upright behind them, looming over the cab like a coffin stood on end. And riding there, the small cold doubt came and sat with him, the way it always comes once the deed is done and the money is gone. $95. The rent unpaid and the larder thin, and here he was with a dead giant lashed to a borrowed truck, and the whole town watching him pass from behind its lace curtains. He could feel them. The slight movement of a curtain at the Dunhams, a face at the post office window, the soft amusement of a place that had already made up its mind about a man. Maybe Cyrus was right. Maybe he had bought stupid. Maybe an old man alone in an empty shop had finally reached for the one comfort that was left to him, which was to believe the world still had a secret in it worth 50 years of looking. The doubt rode the whole way home with him, cold as the window glass. And then, somewhere past the cemetery road where the elms went bare, he heard her. Not aloud, he was not a fanciful man, and the dead do not speak on county roads. But he heard Edith all the same, dry and gentle, and faintly amused the way she'd been at every fool thing he ever did and loved him through anyway. Well, Walter, you bought it. Best go find out what you bought. And that was enough. That was always enough. The boy let him off at the alley door and helped him muscle the clock down and went home to his supper, and Walter Pole stood alone in the cooling dark beside the shop he could no longer pay for, with the ruined clock leaning over him and the key already in his hand, and went inside to find out what he had bought. Inside, the shop held the particular cold of a room no fire had warmed in days. And the smell of it was the only thing that had not changed in all the years Walter Pole had owned it. Brass and oil and old wood and the faint grain tang of clock-cleaning solution, and under all of it something he could not have named that was simply the smell of his own life. He lit the lamp on the workbench because the overhead bulb threw shadows the wrong way for close work. And he had always done his finest work by lamplight, the way his own master had taught him in a back room in Fort Wayne 50 years gone. Edith's chair sat where it always sat, just to the left of the bench, the cushion gone flat and shiny with the shape of her, and he did not look at it directly, the way you learn not to look directly at a thing that will undo you if you let it. He set the lamp. He set his spectacles up his nose with one knuckle. Then he turned to the clock, leaning in the corner like a drunk against a wall, 9 feet of ruined walnut and water stain and silence, and he went to work the only way the work could be done, which was slowly. The young men, the few who'd ever tried the trade before, it died under them, had wanted the clock to come back the way they wanted everything to come back, all at once, on demand, the way a switch gives you light. They'd take a seized movement and they'd force it, lever the wheels, crack a pivot off short, and call the clock dead and themselves cheated. They never understood that a movement gummed solid with 60 years of dust and dried oil and the slow varnish that old grease turns into is not broken. It is only stopped. And a stopped thing has all the time in the world. The only question is whether the man working on it does too. Walter did. He had nothing now but time. He took the hood off first, easing it forward off the case the way you'd lift a hat from a sleeping man, and he set the long, warped door aside, and he drew the seized movement out of its seatboard and clamped it gentle in the padded vise. Then he reached for the little oil can with a long, thin spout, penetrating oil, light and creeping. The kind that finds its way into a joint by capillary patience and not by force, and he laid one careful bead of it at every pivot, every arbor, every place where steel had frozen to brass, and then he did the hardest thing in the whole trade, which was nothing. He waited. He sat in the lamplight in his own dead quiet shop while the oil crept where oil creeps, and he let it work the slow way. And he did not touch the movement for the better part of an hour. He filled the kettle and made tea he half forgot to drink. He looked once at Edith in her frame, half smiling off camera, in her dusty rose Sunday dress, with a little cameo at her throat, and he said, not loud, "Patience," she'd say. "You and your patience, Walter." When he came back to the bench, the oil had done its first quiet work, and the great wheel gave him the smallest fraction of a degree when he leaned a finger against it, not free, not yet, but no longer stone. So he worked it. Back and forward and back, a hair at a time, oil and pressure and oil again, freeing each pivot the way you'd ease a splinter that's been in the skin so long the flesh has grown around it. Never yanking, always coaxing, because brass remembers being forced, and steel remembers being forced, and 100-year-old movement will punish a hasty man with a snapped arbor he can never replace. The grime came off the train in long gray curls under his picks and his soft brush, and the solution that stung his split knuckles. He stripped the wheels down and cleaned each one and pegged out each pivot hole with a sharpened length of boxwood until the holes ran bright. And all the while he listened, because the last thing the dead trade taught, the thing the manuals never wrote down, was that a clock will tell you what's wrong if you only learn to hear it. He had a length of brass rod he'd carried 40 years, worn smooth at one end where it touched the bone behind his ear, and he pressed it to the plate and put the other end to his skull and turned the wheels by hand and listened down the metal the way a country doctor listens down a chest, for the catch, for the drag, for the one tooth in 500 that wasn't meeting its neighbor true. He found the drag. He freed it. He reassembled the train by lamplight with hands that had done it 10,000 times, big-knuckled, work-scarred, and steadier on that bench than they were anywhere else on God's earth, and he set the movement back in the case. And he hung the weights he'd rigged from his own shop stock since the originals were 60 years gone, and he set the pendulum to swinging with one fingertip, and then he stepped back and he waited a third time. For a long moment, nothing. The pendulum swung and slowed, and the shop held its breath with him. And then the escapement caught. He heard it before he was sure he'd heard it, a small, dry, living sound, the palate dropping onto the tooth and the tooth giving it back, tick. And then, after a heartbeat that lasted a year, tock, and a clock that the whole county had laughed out of the auction yard as firewood began, in the lamplight, in the cold, an hour before midnight, to keep time. Walter Pole stood very still and let it run. He did not whoop. He was not a whooping man. But something came up his throat and stung behind the round wire spectacles, and he took them off and pressed the bridge of his nose, and when he put them back, the clock was still ticking, even and patient and alive, the way a heart sounds when it has decided after all to go on beating. He let it run up to the hour. He wanted to hear it strike. And at midnight, with the count wheel coming round at last, after 60 silent years, the strike train let go, the hammer lifted, the gong drew its first long bronze breath, and on that first heavy stroke of 12, deep inside the hood, behind the carved fretwork where no hand was meant to reach, something Agustin Reyes had built to wait for, exactly this gave way. A weighted lever the strike had tripped dropped a hidden bolt, and the false back panel of the hood swung loose on a tongue of dovetailed walnut so fine Walter had not even seen the seam. He startled. Then he understood, the way one craftsman understands another across the years, that this was no accident, that a man had sat at a bench like this one and reasoned it through, that the day this clock ticked and struck again would be the day a real clocksmith had finally laid hands on it, and that to such a man, and only to such a man, the clock should open. Walter brought the lamp close. In the compartment, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff with age, lay a sheaf of banknotes. The big old style bills they didn't print any more, larger than the money in his thin wallet, a thickness of them that made his breath go shallow, and bound beside them with a perished rubber band that crumbled at his touch. A packet of war bonds, Series E, bought in the 40s and never cashed. 20 years of quiet interest drawing in the dark, while the world that issued them forgot the man who'd bought them. And tucked beneath a flat tin that had once held tobacco, and inside the tin a stack of letters, and laid on top of the letters a sepia photograph of an old man Walter knew at once. He'd seen that face. Years back, before the war even, at the county fairs and the church bazaars, a gaunt, dignified man with deep walnut-brown skin and a sweeping iron-gray mustache and small steel spectacles, in a fine, threadbare brown suit with a watch chain across the vest, who built furniture and mended clocks better than any man in 3 counties and got fewer jobs every year as the factory lines came up out. Of Indianapolis, and the talk turned, the way it turns, against the man whose name didn't sound like the others, Agustin Reyes. They'd written him off. The county had let his trade die the same slow way it was letting Walter's die now, and Walter, holding the man's photograph in the lamplight, felt the kinship of it land in his chest like a hand. He had read the maker's hand already, out in the auction yard in the dovetails. Now he had the maker's face. He set the photograph down with great care, and he opened the first letter. They were to a girl, to a daughter. Pearl, the first one began, in a careful immigrant copperplate that pressed hard on the downstrokes. And Walter read 3 of them and then stopped reading whole and only let his eyes touch pieces, because a man's private grief is not a thing to be devoured, even a dead man's. They were apologies, a decade of them. A letter a year, near enough, and not one ever sent. A father writing to a daughter he had let drift away in some old hardness neither of them could undo across the distance. Writing I was too proud, and I told myself I would send for you when the shop did better, and the shop never did better, and the years went, and you must think I did not want you, and I write again the same coward's letter I wrote last winter. And folded into the later ones, mention of the money, that he was setting it by, that he would not touch it though the rent went short, because it was hers. So that one day, When he found the nerve at last to send for her, she would not come to him empty, but would have something solid under her, something to start a life on, the start in this country he had failed to give her when she was small. He had counted every silent year. He had meant the whole time to come home to her. And he had died. Walter understood it now, plain as the cold in the room, before he ever found the nerve to mail a single page. The shop had been foreclosed, the clock hauled out for firewood, and everything the old man had saved, and everything he had been too proud and too frightened to say, had ridden out into the world, sealed up inside a dead clock that nobody could make tick. Walter sat with the last letter a long while. The new clock kept its patient time beside him. Then he laid the page down gentle on the bench, smoothed it once with his big scarred thumb, and said, soft to the lamplight and to the photograph, and to the man who could no longer hear him, all right, I'll finish it for you. It took him 2 days to find her, and 2 counties of asking, and on the 3rd afternoon he drove his old truck up to a tired clapboard rooming house in a mill town, where a woman named Pearl Reyes Vane waited tables at a diner by the highway and was. The landlady told him through the screen, behind on her rent, the same as everybody. He waited on the step in the long gold light of a late autumn afternoon, his cap in his big hands, until she came up the walk in her flat brown shoes and her worn brown cardigan with the missing button, slight and wiry and prematurely lined, her dark hair going early gray, her eyes going wary the second they found a stranger at her door. He did not say much. He had never said much. He told her his name and his trade, and that he had come from Sumac County, and he saw the county's name flinch across her face, the place she'd grown up sure her father had not wanted her, the place she had left and never gone back to. And then Walter Pole put the tin of letters into her work, thinned hands, and the photograph on top where she would see it first, and he said only, these are yours. He wrote them to you. He kept them for you. He counted every year. She stood there on her own doorstep in the gold light and opened the tin and read her own name in her father's hard-pressed hand, and Walter watched the thing she had carried her whole life, that she had been the unwanted one, the one not sent for, watched it break apart and fall away, because here in her hands was the proof. 10 years of it, that the silence had never once been indifference. It had been a frightened, proud old man who loved her too much to come empty and too little to come at all. She wept on the step, not prettily and not briefly, but the deep, racking way a person weeps when a wound 40 years deep is finally allowed to close, and Walter stood with his cap in his hands and let her, because some griefs you do not interrupt. You only stand near them so the person is not alone. He gave her the bonds and the great share of the cash, where Augustine had always meant them to go, a start in this country under her at last. For himself, Walter kept only the fair finder's portion, the honest share any man in his trade would take, and it was exactly enough and not $1 more. Enough to clear 3 months of back rent on Pole clock and watch, enough to put the light back on in the window, enough to keep Edith's empty chair beside a working bench a while longer. Word of it got back to Sumac County the way everything does, and the town that had hooted Walter Pole to the cashier's table went quiet about it, and stayed quiet, which from that town was the loudest thing it knew how to say. The grandfather clock he'd bought for $95 stood now in the front of his shop where the street could see it. Restored and upright and keeping time so true you could set your wristwatch by the very thing that had killed his trade. And one gray afternoon, Cyrus Bolts, who had laughed loudest of anybody, slowed his scrap truck to a crawl going past the lit window and looked a long moment at the tall clock ticking away in there, alive, perfect, the dead thing he'd called firewood. And he said not one word, and he drove on. Because the worth of a thing does not always show on the surface, and it does not always arrive on time. Sometimes it sits 60 years in the dark, written off and hauled out for kindling, waiting on the one patient pair of hands that knows a stopped clock is not an empty one, and all it has ever asked of us is that we not laugh, and that we listen, and that we be willing to wait in the cold for the tick to come. If a story like this stayed with you, subscribe to Worth Unseen, and I'll see you at the next auction.